Okay, well, welcome all. This is the Portland Clean Energy Fund Grants Committee meeting, and we're going to start up, as we always do, with an inspirational moment. And Michael Edenhill, one of our committee members, has volunteered to do that for us tonight. Oh, you're muted though.
This has been a day. I'm Michael Edenhill, and I would just like to acknowledge that May Day just came by, and it's one of my favorite days. It's Labor Day in the rest of the world, and it's Labor Day here too. And on Labor Day, I'd like to remember that this country was built by the labor of brown and black women. And every day I know that I have to actively work towards gender equity. I have to destroy my stereotypes that I find, especially in the construction industry. And I have to fight the sexist biases that were taught to men and myself. And I'm grateful for the women who came before me, paving the way for us workers to get fair wages, 8-hour days, the rights to organize and protect ourselves. We continue this struggle, and I'd like to thank one person, one of my labor heroes, which is Lucy Parsons. And Lucy Parsons is the woman who is known by the Chicago Police Department as more dangerous than 1,000 rioters. Parsons was a dedicated anarchist, a labor organizer who fought throughout her life for freedom against state repression through the establishment of some of the most storied institutions in US labor history. Parsons played a significant role in the fight for the 8-hour workday, the organization of the first May Day, and the founding of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and the industrial workers of the world. In 1905, Lucy Parsons spoke to the IWW convention. We, the women of this country, have no ballot, even if we wish to use it. And the only way that we can be represented is to take a man to represent us. You men have made such a mess of it in representing us that we have no confidence in asking you. We women are the slaves of slaves. We are exploited more ruthlessly than men. Whenever wages are to be reduced, the capitalist class use women to reduce them. And if there's anything you men should do to the future, it's let the women organize. Last year, writer Kim Kelly reminded us that Black women's voices have been suppressed and left unrecognized for far too long, even within a workers' rights movement that they helped build from the ground up. It's vitally important to remember and to learn the history and support their modern day counterparts' work. Because without Black women, the US labor movement undoubtedly would have been doomed from the start. My own grandmother, Connie, was given to the state of Illinois upon her birth. And around the age of 6, she was adopted by a white family where she was enslaved. She wasn't allowed to go to school. She did all the household and domestic duties. She acted as a nanny to the children and the cook for the family, the laundress for all the soiled items. And at 14, she was the child to be raped by her, quote, father. At 16, she escaped and became an officer of the NAACP, and then went on to become an officer of the NAACP in Nebraska. She raised lawyers, engineers, drivers, and hustlers. She was powerful, filled with love and rage. Alicia Garza writes that the history of Black women in the economy is rooted in the legacy of slavery. Enslaved Black women were forced to provide care, work, unpaid for white families. We can make Black Lives Matter in the labor movement by building the kinds of movements that Black women need to shape a new economy, a new democracy, that don't force them to choose between making a living and being a part of a healthy democracy. It's time to care for Black women that care for us.
Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, I'm going to start off with some just mundane housekeeping related to virtual participation, and a reminder to the folks who have logged on to the meeting that if you're interested in providing public comment, please indicate that you are through the chat box. If there's anyone who has just called in on the telephone, we'll open up the phone lines after the chat box, after we get public comments. Get through the chat box list. If there are any The raise hand function is for committee members only and is just used to manage the conversation. Likewise, we ask that the video be only used for committee members and staff who are participating in the conversation. Public members will be muted unless giving public comment, and also for introductions. And also a reminder that this meeting is being recorded and that there is captioning available. And if you are logged onto the Zoom meeting, you can find that option to see the captioning by just kind of scrolling up to the menu bar. It's often in where the 3 little dots that you click on and get kind of a drop down list of more options. That's where you find that. So I'd like to start with introductions and then we'll move on to public comment. We're gonna go with committee members and I'll just say your first name and then you can unmute yourself and introduce yourself. So we'll start with Robin.
Hi, Robin Wang, committee member, he, him.
Faith.
Good evening, everyone. Great to see you. Faith Graham, committee member, she, her.
Ranfis.
Ranfis Giannatino Vittoro, you see him pronouns, committee member.
Jeff.
Jeffrey Moreland, committee member, he, him.
Megan.
Hi, everybody. Megan Horst, committee member, she, her.
Andrea.
Hi, Andrea Hamburg, committee member, she, her.
Michael.
Michael Eden Hill, an exhausted he, him.
Maria.
Maria Sippen, she, they, committee member.
And Shanice Clark, a committee member, is excused from tonight's meeting. She's not going to be able to attend. So we'll move to staff now. I'm Katie Lister, PCEF staff. Sam?
Jan Barroso, PCEF staff, he, him.
James?
James Valdez, PCEF staff, he, him.
Janet?
Janet Hammer, PCEF staff, she, her.
June?
June Reyes, PCEF staff, she, her.
Okay, and then I would ask that folks who have logged on, who are on the meeting, who have logged on, if you could just put your name and affiliation into the chat box. Sam will read those out. Sam, do you see those?
I see them, but I haven't seen any roll in yet. So
okay,
we've got them coming in.
Yeah, sorry. I should have mentioned
Jenny
that
Hall.
earlier.
Jenny Hall, Energy Trust of Oregon, she, her. Anissa Pemberton, PCEF Coalition Coordinator, they, them. Angela Collicock, Oregon Solar Energy Industries Association. Cameron Starr, Energy Trust of Oregon, him, his. Jeff Strang, NAACP, no pronoun preferences. Daniela Chansey, related, Northwest. Lynn Lindgren Schroeder, Housing Development Center, she, her. Troy Zblowski, sorry if I did not get that right, and apologies to anyone whose name I mispronounced. Neil Kelly Company. Paul Philpott, Carpenters, he, him. Deidre Schutz, Nutrition Garden RX, she, her. And Joshua Baker, Lloyd Eco District, he, him.
And is there, June or James, can you unmute the phone? Is there anyone who called in on the phone?
No, no line on the phone.
Okay. And I don't see anyone who has indicated a desire to for public comment. So I think that we will just jump right into it. This entire meeting, with the exception of a few minutes at the end, is going to be dedicated to workforce and contractor equity. And Sam and Janet are your fine presenters for the evening.
Okay, great. Thank you, Katie. So I think we've got probably about 17 slides or so. So there's going to be a lot of context in those. So as we go through it, just hope that people ask questions, because that'll certainly be really important. And so just as we set the stage for today, we've given you all a high-level overview. Or at last, I actually think it might have been one of our last in-person meetings at the Junkie Delta Center. It was our last in-person meeting on March 10th, where we outlined some of the workforce and contractor elements. But before we do that, so that was just, we gave a little context on that. And so we're going to really do a deeper dive into that here today. And just to give you a little bit of context on the work that we as staff have done to get you here today and some things ahead of you also, so we sort of bound that up. We brought together about over 50 stakeholders at the New Song Community Space in Northeast Portland back on January 22nd for our first conversation where, and these were stakeholders, nonprofit stakeholders, workforce stakeholders, labor, diverse business stakeholders, and others that came together to talk about what were elements of workforce and contractor equity and sort of laid out an approach. We got great feedback then, and we followed up, and our follow-ups actually took place last week in 3 discussions. And these were all held over webinar where we had breakout groups and whatever else, but we had about over 70 participants participate last week in 3 discussions focused on capital projects, focused on workforce and contractor development, and focused on planning grants. And you're gonna get a little more context on why that focus was broken out that way. And so what we did with them is we had a document that was ultimately what is gonna be take form as our workforce and contractor equity template and agreements. And we sent that out yesterday. And so we forwarded that to you all as well. We sent that out to stakeholders yesterday. And that's out for now for about a week until next Monday, where we have a survey that accompanied that so that they can provide comments on that. And so it won't take a little bit of shape. It'll take a minute to take some shape. And so we'll get into that in the next slide. But I wanted to just acknowledge those are some of the sort of broader public sessions we've had. And we'll get that feedback. Once we get that feedback from that survey, we're going to come back to you all on May 21st as a follow-up conversation of this one. So I should have said, Katie, next slide, actually. So maybe this is just where I'll lay that out. Within the PCEF initiative, we've identified really 3 core elements that are part of how we implement workforce and contractor equity. There is a workforce and contractor equity plan, and we'll talk about that in a second and what really falls into that. There is workforce and contractor equity agreements. We'll talk about those as well. And those are really agreements that every single project agrees to that is funded by PCEF. And then there are the funding buckets. And so these are what you all have had a little preview on. These are the investments that we've already, the investments that go into this sector. And so I've just outlined a little bit of what you see on this slide. And that speaks to what you saw on January 22nd, where we hosted a design session, the follow-up discussions that took place last week, this follow-up survey that went up in response to those discussions, and the fact that we'll also have some public comment as another opportunity for stakeholders to provide feedback. So it just gives you a little sense of some of the things that we're going to round out in order to bring feedback to you all. Next slide. So within the PCEF code, it specifically calls out that the PCEF committee shall adopt a workforce and contractor equity plan to ensure that the work funded by the committee is being performed by historically disadvantaged groups, including measurable and ambitious goals for training and hiring of historically disadvantaged groups, including women, people of color, people with disabilities, and the chronically underemployed, as well as measurable goals for contracting with businesses owned or operated by such groups. What I don't have captured here is that you all are also supposed to prominently display the committee, the program's goals in meeting those objectives on the website, and that it'll be your top priority to address any shortcomings of those. So we're going to get a little bit into what are the implications of those. But I wanted to lay out just that high level context that it is really baked into the initiative, and even the very first language that identifies the goals of PCEF calls out the development of a diverse contracting and workforce pool. Next slide. And so this is another section within the initiative that calls out that this is one of the terms of the grants, that every single grant that is funded by PCEF shall agree to a workforce and contractor equity agreement. And so so there's going to be layers, and I know Janet in a little bit will dig into to more of that to give you some more context. And so next slide. And then the last piece on what I just teed up is the fact that we also previously discussed that you all are going to be making funding decisions. And so essentially there's a high level plan that outlines how exactly we're moving this work forward and making sure that those include measurable, ambitious goals. Then there are agreements, and that's all of the projects that are funded by PCEF need to agree to workforce and contractor equity agreements. And then there's the specific investments you all make in order to support that work. And so there's a few levels to this. And we're going to certainly talk a lot about how those come together, but certainly the focus tonight will be on the workforce and contractor equity agreement template. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Janet, who's done the large body of work in getting us here today and thinking through this, and just welcome any questions as we go along.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, this one's definitely a little talk heavy on the front end, and then we have time for questions and conversation, but certainly flag us if there's something that you need to clarify along the way, because there's a lot. So as Sam mentioned, there's the Workforce and Contractor Equity Plan. And just to share our approach to that, as Sam mentioned, back in January, we had this stakeholder session where we sort of rolled out, here's what we're thinking about an approach to the plan and the agreements. What do you think? And there was strong support that we were heading in the right direction. The three kind of components to our approach. So first, regarding the goals, we don't have the information today that we need to define measurable and ambitious goals. We have information about the construction industry in the city and the region, but it doesn't have a breakdown regarding clean energy jobs and certainly not regarding regenerative ag and green infrastructure. We have some data about clean energy jobs at the state level and congressional district level, but we don't have data disaggregated by demographics. So we've kind of got this, you know, in order to set ambitious and measurable goals that are meaningful, they're useful, they're defensible, there's some information we need. So we've got kind of thought out about an approach to understanding what kinds of investments are likely to be made, what's the current capacity to, or what capacity would be required to implement those projects, what's the current labor and contractor supply, and then what would those gaps look like. So to get there, that's a year or two kind of process with stakeholders and data analysts to generate that information. So that's kind of thinking about defining those goals. We also know that the approach is about building that pipeline. It's great to have goals, but we need to make the investments to, you know, if you aren't building the pipeline, then they're just numbers on a piece of paper and you're not working to get there. So we know we have the dollars that are set aside for 20 to 25% of PCEF funds allocated to the clean energy jobs training and apprentice training and contractor support. Once we have those goals defined, the committee can use that information to even more precisely shape funding priorities to strategically move dollars towards where there might be identified gaps and needs. So that's one way that the building the pipeline and the plan are connected. And then again, enhancing capacity. You know, we know that it's important to not just say thou shalt be good with your workforce and contracting, but make the investments that help folks succeed at creating an inclusive workplace and contracting relationship. And so we have our eye on what are the things that we need to do to help folks succeed in attaining those goals. So that's kind of the approach to how we're thinking about how we address the workforce and contractor equity plan. Next slide. Now the agreements, as Sam mentioned, that anyone who receives PCEF money has to sign on to a workforce and contractor equity agreement. And as we approached this, we thought, wow, we are going to have so many different sizes and types of projects, you know, everything from a planning grant to installation of green infrastructure, a $10,000 grant, $1 million grant. So how do we really think about agreements that are going to fit such a diverse context of project sizes and types and organizational sizes and types? The way that we've thought about this big picture first is also three components. So first, as you make your application, there are a series of questions that you'll ask that or answer that address some workforce and contractor equity elements. And the ones that you're asked are going to vary depending on what type of project you're applying for. So if you're doing, workforce contractor development, like programming grant, there's a whole bunch of questions that won't even show up for you because they're not relevant. But there's a series of questions that you answer, and your answers become part of your workforce and contractor equity agreement. And you will be reporting on the commitments that you made. The third element is, again, around this allocation of resources to help folks succeed. We want people to be successful with their applications and with the implementation. So, we're thinking about what are the trainings, the technical assistance, the templates, the compilation of best practices that'll help people do this work successfully. An example of that, again, if I stand up and say, you should be healthy or you should be inclusive, and you're like, oh, what does that mean? So we want to help people be able to do the work well. So the approach here, you answer some questions, your commitments become part of your contract, you report on those, and we want to support people in their success. Next slide. So there were a variety of factors, considerations that were informing our approach to the workforce and contractor equity plan and the agreements, and I thought it would be helpful to just kind of share what was some of the thinking as we were developing these. So the first is, it's a race to the top approach. So rather than stating, here's what the target is that you should achieve, pulling a number out of the air that may or may not be attainable, it's not really legally defensible because people aren't really basing it on anything yet. We're asking folks to declare what they think they can deliver with their application, target it to specific populations if that's who they're working with. It really helps to raise the bar because people know that to be competitive, they need to stake a claim for good numbers and deliver on that performance. So kind of that race to the top approach, aiming for strong performance. Accountability is fostered because the goals and the strategies that an applicant defines becomes part of their grant agreement. So now you're accountable for that, and future funding considerations are going to be impacted. If you say you're going to deliver something and you don't deliver, not going to be so solid when you come back next time for funding. The approach is responsive. Again, we really needed to be mindful that there's so many different sizes and types of projects, and we need to be able to accommodate that. We also, again, needed to be meeting legal scrutiny. There's things that you can and can't do when it comes to trying to set goals. And so we needed something that would be legally defensible. We also wanted to build on the lessons learned that are out there. There's been a lot of work in the city, in the region, and nationally about how to help move the needle. And so we were definitely drawing on those to inform our approach. We wanted to think about how we could deliver measures that are consistent with the intent of PCEF legislation and also workable in the field. We've really been living with this question about how to strike that balance of getting, at the end of the day, we must have information to tell us if we're reaching our goals, and that means you need data. You need that information, but we also don't want to be burdensome and unworkable to applicants. So we've been really, trying to have those conversations to find out how can we build on platforms people are used to using, or support people in the learning curve to adjust to something else, but really get information that's both meaningful and manageable. And then finally, we just want to approach this with a continuous improvement mindset. So just knowing that we're going to evolve our frameworks as we, over time, respond to changing conditions and end user feedback, and iterate and improve. Next slide. So to recap, as Sam said, so there's a plan where we're defining our goals and thinking about how that can help build the pipeline and build capacity for folks to succeed with the work. We have agreements that every grantee makes their commitments to. And then we have some specific grants that are going directly toward workforce and contractor development investments. So that's, how are we on time? Because it feels like we're ahead, Sam and Katie.
I think this is an important piece, at least just to pause, because I think when we spoke to this idea of there's a plan, there's agreements, and there's grants, I really want to just check that folks understand those three elements of how how we see workforce and contractor equity being moved within this program, and each of them fill a specific role. And certainly, and I think, and at least, and I want to make sure there's clarity around what we are suggesting, what we're saying about the plan. So just want to welcome questions, clarifying pieces, and I'm sure we can continue chatting about that. But
yeah, so on deck, originally we would pause, take a break, and dig into a little bit of the agreements and then open for conversation. But I think we're good on time, and this is a logical place to just take a pause and see if the information we've shared thus far is making sense or resonating, or if you have any questions.
Megan?
Hi. Yeah, I have a question about the plan. I think as a planner, always thinking about these sorts of things, but you just mentioned on the defining goal, or on the goals, you mentioned how there's not great data to create goals. And I just wonder if you could just say more about, like, how will we create awesome goals?
Yeah, we will be able to create some goals, but it isn't, well, and Sam, jump in here if you'd like. So some folks are used to seeing a target that's based on a disparity study. And so if we were to take the approach of we're going to set targets, it requires a certain kind of disparity study. We can explain a little bit about what that is, but those take a lot of time, they take a lot of money, and we actually might not discover a disparity because it's tied to, these were government contracts that were offered. These were the folks that had outreach and applied, and we can show a systematic exclusion of those people. And in some of our spaces, like we haven't had contracts in regenerative ag or green infrastructure, or the solar industry hasn't been developed enough that we could say there was a disparity. So we don't have a disparity study to set targets, and if we generated one, it might not yield useful information. So it isn't something that we could legally or defensively set our own targets and say thou shalt, and it just would be kind of misguided because we don't know what the supply is or what's going to be needed. Our thought is that if we can get kind of a sense of, oh yeah, go ahead.
And that point, I think it's important that we don't, the context, I think a lot of the context where workforce and contractor equity agreements, community benefited agreements, project labor agreements, these agreements that have floated around in this ecosystem have been developed for large construction projects, large capital projects, usually on the scale of 10 million, 20 million plus. And so that's where we do have better data around what firms are out there that can do this work, what does the workforce look like. And so there certainly is better data, but when we move into a lot of the types of projects we would target within PCEF, it is just more specific, that there is just that data doesn't exist at that granularity, like around solar, around energy efficiency. It is more in this, are there all these, so there's a mismatch in terms of what sort of the history of the analysis that's been done to support these sorts of efforts around around public construction in the past.
And there's two pieces to that. There's, can we get data, and does it meet the threshold of a disparity study? So if we wanted to have some information like a market study and set some, like here's the kinds of things we're looking for, and people can self-identify what goals they're setting, is different than we've made targets that are based on, race or gender, has a different level of what flies legally. as far as the data, so it's not that there's no data, it's just it doesn't exist in the way that we need it right now. And so that was the time frame for the planning. The thought was we could do kind of a range of scenarios. We could say, well, here's the existing tree coverage and here's where it's low. And if we assume this many tree plantings per year, it would look like this. And if we looked at where the building home residential housing stock looks like this, and if we were doing this many weatherizations per year, it would look like this. So if we came up with some scenarios, low, medium, and high, of what kinds of investments would be reasonably logical, and then thought about roughly what the work would be required to do those things, and then had a sense of what the existing supply is, then we could get a sense of, oh, you know, we want to be looking towards 15% to 20% over here or something. So it's not that we can't come up with some reasonable guide points and then use that information to feed back into the system. How did it look, you know, this year or 5 years later? But that will take some time and investment. It's not something that can be done like this month, we just created it. So that's a longer term, you know, a year or two to create that plan, and then use that information to see, are we moving the needle on those target groups? Could we use that information to think about funding, you know, this year more of X instead of Y? Katie?
So Janet, I just wanted to note that Ranfis has had his hand up for a while, and then also Michael and Maria have comments. Ranfis?
Super, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for developing this framework. Hopefully I understood this correctly, but it sounds like by putting the plan in the front end, you're asking each applicant to basically define their own goals. And I think systemically what we're saying as a committee is we're using the competitive grant making process to make this a race to the top. So if folks know that they're trying to compete with a tight applicant pool with limited dollars, that, you know, this is an opportunity to try to shine or excel against other applicants. It sounds like what they submit from their plan could be a measurable, enforceable goal in the agreement. Whereas I think my understanding currently is, as like the city or the county or the Port or other agencies, they put in an aspirational goal. They remain aspirational. They can't be hard set goals, which has been, I think, what I've heard from many stakeholders, a frustration in being able to move the needle. But here, I think it seems like we have at least a legally defensible approach if it's proposed or saying this is what they're capable of doing, or this is what they're proposing to do, and we're giving them an award for what they're proposing. Hopefully I'm capturing what has been displayed, but I think I'm generally excited with at least this direction, given the short timeline that we're in, the lack of disparity studies we have, or workforce or contracting market studies right now.
And Ron Face, it should feel familiar to you because you're familiar with the Move America. I'm not getting the full name right, but
yeah, Jobs to Move for America.
Thank you. Yeah, they use a similar that kind of approach of, I believe, you know, naming the goals, and that becomes part of the contract.
Michael?
Sorry, I'm pushing the wrong buttons. So my question was, what are we defining as sort of equity in this case? Are we talking about number of women and people of color hired? Are we talking about wages, benefits, access, continued employment after a job is complete? They're not just hiring and then turning around and firing or laying off. What kind of equity lens are we applying to a contractor workforce equity agreement?
Super great question. We'll get into that a little bit tonight and more at the next work session. Right now, we were just trying to get the overall framework of how we're addressing this high level goal around workforce and contractor equity and the pieces that are required in the legislation around the plan, the agreements, and the dollar flow. And then we can definitely get into that hugely important fine-grained detail.
Maria?
My question was also along the lines of what Michael had just asked, but I have one more that's maybe a little bit more basic, referring to an earlier slide about the Portland City Code and naming those priority groups like women, people of color, people with disabilities, and chronically underemployed. My question is, are people with work permits or people who are not US citizen workers by default lumped in under the people of color label, or do we have an opportunity to call that out somewhere in the plan or specifically in the screening criteria or criteria for applications? Where is our best bet to ensure equity, for example, for immigrant populations and people who have a work permit but not US citizenship?
So I'll take one cut at that, and then maybe Katie and Sam want to jump in as well. So there are places where you're talking about your recruitment strategy and then your utilization goals, and people can speak to the groups that are specifically called out in the legislation and any other target populations they might have, like formerly incarcerated or youth or veterans or immigrants. So there are places for you to talk about any other specific populations that are a focus of yours. Katie, Sam, you want to chime in or see if that was answering your question, Maria?
I think.
No,
Katie, you want to?
I just wanted to note that Robin also has had his hand up, but yes, please go.
Great. So I think first I just acknowledge, Maria, it's a great question. I think what Janet said is correct from the outset around folks specifying in their application, do they have a target workforce that they are targeting? So beyond sort of that do they have a more specific, are they working on formerly incarcerated? So there's room within the application to specify that. And that's certainly going to be that we're going to the legal questions around how we can score those different elements. On the back end, which I think the back end is incredibly, if not more important, around how we track that information and how folks are following up, because it is really incredibly important that we track who is getting on these projects, what are their hours. I think that's an outstanding question around the existing platforms that we use. So one that is out there that we use that we've talked about in these conversations is, and we'll get to this, but is just LCP Tracker, Labor Compliance Tracker, Labor Compliance Platform. It's one of those acronyms anyways. And so that's a question we have with our city staff that manage that, just whether folks can be categorized in that way and what are the implications. So it's a good question that I think we still need to follow up and see, is that something we can do? And just what does that mean in alignment with how folks currently use these sort of platforms and ask these questions of their crew?
Yeah, so I guess I would just add to that, because I think, Maria, part of your question was related to the list that is in the code. And the list that is, and I think that the applicant would need to, in their application, if their target population is an immigrant group, they would need to indicate if that group that they were targeting were people of color, or if they were women, or if they were chronically underemployed, or people with disabilities. And so I guess, and I know Robin and Jeff both have his hands up, but I guess I would ask if you think that there is, that might create a problem for some groups.
I mean, I think we can be really straightforward about being inclusive around those groups and not creating any fear concerns around people having to disclose that and maybe their priority workforce. But, you know, considering at a time like this, especially, we have some anecdotes and preliminary data across the country about who's been impacted by this pandemic and who's going to have more trouble returning to work. And if we have the opportunity now to try to reduce some of those barriers and create quality, long-term, you know, good jobs for people who would struggle entering the workforce again, I think that's something we could be more explicit about wherever it's possible, and maybe add some narrative to the code so that we can continue to be inclusive. But you know, I really defer to you all on where that language is better fitting, or if that goes into, you know, the scoring process somehow, an application process rather than a plan like this. But in as many places as we can include it, I think that will strengthen its purpose and help us create the outcomes that we want.
Thanks, Maria. Robin?
Yeah, hi. So if I understand the agenda for the rest of today, we're going to be spending most of our time talking about the agreements, that purple arrow. Can you just quickly touch upon, you know, what has been or what will be done for building pipeline and enhancing capacity? I know that you've already done some work in that area. Is that done? Is that still evolving? Just kind of curious what's happening on that front.
So the building pipeline piece is inherently, it is actually, that plan connects, that building pipeline is the 8 to 10 million that goes and funnels into this sector. So that speaks to that 8 to 10 million that you all will be funding for pre-apprenticeship programs, for workforce development programs, for contractor support programs. That is the building of the pipeline and supporting that work, and enhancing the capacity inherently is really, it's these criteria that we hold. I mean, certainly it is the technical assistance, but it ties into these grant agreements, because that is ultimately, we are leveling up everyone as they're doing this work. And so the grant agreement brings that accountability as we enhance their capacity and we get them to compete. So the plan, the sort of singular part where the plan really brings these all together, but ultimately the piece that stands apart in that plan is going to be that the long-term defining of the goals. That is going to be an iterative process as you get the data coming out of these grants that you award, and as you learn from that we will be able to feed that in and define those goals.
And that capacity shows up in a few places, like even in the application itself, when we say like, tell us about your strategy to recruit and retain and advance a diverse workforce, we include, you know, some examples of best practice are, you know, just again, trying to steer people towards the kinds of things that one would be looking for if you wanted to actually be successful in achieving those goals. And then there's other capacity things around, you know, what are the different workshops or things that we could do to help people get even stronger on, you know, if people are saying like, I'm really struggling on how to create an inclusive workforce, or how do I do this anti-harassment thing, then, you know, there's other kinds of things that we offer or can offer or partner with other great things that are being done by others in the region. Does that make sense?
Jeffrey, you had your hand up, but now it is down. Did you have a question or a comment that you wanted to add?
No, that last question answered it for me. So
okay. Okay, great. All right, Janet, Sam, you guys ready to keep plugging away?
Yeah, we were, the next slide says break, but it sounds like we're moving the break and continuing into some content.
We'll still plan to take the break a little bit late, just a little bit after 7.
Okay. So as we saw earlier, there are questions that show up in the application, and some of them will not apply to you because you're doing workforce development and not building something. Some of them might show up because you are going to be contracting, but maybe you're not hiring people to be building something. So there's sort of a skip pattern that shows up in the application. If you look on the left column, you see a question mark icon and you see a checkbox icon. So the way this is structured is there are questions that you answer if it's applicable to your proposal. That's the question mark icon. And then there's things that you agree to if you were funded. So in the first box, you see towards the left, the organization, information about the organization. So there's going to be some questions that get asked for all of the applicants that are in the set of questions about your organization that particularly have to do with worker and contractor equity. So there's a question about how you create a positive and inclusive workplace culture. There's a question about how you prioritize recruitment, retention, and advancement of a diverse workforce. And there's a question about whether the organization offers benefits. So those are part questions that get scored on your application. If you are successful, then your workforce and contractor equity agreement is going to confirm that you'll be meeting the wage standard, so the 180% of minimum wage, and that workers aren't misclassified as 1099 contractors when they should be employees. And you're going to confirm that PCEF conducts random payroll audits as a way of ensuring the compliance there. So those are the questions that were specific about an organization that apply to all the applicants. The next section, the middle section in blue, if your proposal is going to include contracting for professional services, suppliers, or construction contracting, then there will be some questions there. And those questions are going to ask about your strategy around recruiting diverse contractors. And as I mentioned just a bit ago, we have some kind of guidance about some of the kinds of things that we might be looking for, the kinds of things that have been proven to be more successful, and your goals around contractor diversity. And then if you are successful in your application, your agreement is going to have a confirmation that when you were considering contractors to for your bid, that you did consider prior contractor performance. So things like they don't show up on the labor violations or something like that. And also confirming that they have good practice around not misclassifying people as 1099 contractors when they should be employees. You have an agreement that you're going to be reporting on those utilization goals that you identified, and that and you'll be reporting that you made your payments and that you're paying within 30 days. And then at the end, that you and your contractors will participate in a brief, very brief 2 or 3 question survey about the quality of the partnership. Again, trying to shift best practice towards not to be fostering more equitable and effective partnership, and just kind of checking in about how that's going. The third bucket of questions is if your project is going to be hiring workers for capital projects, so you're doing solar, weatherization, installing trees, green infrastructure things, again, there will be questions about your recruitment strategy to recruit, retain, and advance diverse workers. There's going to be questions about your goals for hiring diverse workers. There's going to be questions about the wages and benefits, so prioritizing. So again, the legislation has language around wages. It does not have language around a benefits requirement, but we could certainly ask people to tell us what they do or prioritize working with contractors that are offering, better wages and benefits. So there's a question about that. And then the agreements, again, if your proposal is successful and you get an agreement, the agreement is going to confirm that contractors are defining and implementing the recruitment strategy and goals, that there's reporting on the diversity goals and the wages and the benefits. And then also there's a question and a check on workplace health and safety. So beyond meeting OSHA standards, but how you might be thinking about folks at the front lines of climate vulnerability, because some of the work that we're investing puts people more at risk of some of the things that we, way back when we met in person and the county health epidemiologist talked to us about vector-borne disease and exposure to heat and air quality and those kinds of things. So just thinking about how we're thinking about workers' protection in that arena as well. So in a nutshell, you get questions that are asking, have you considered whether and how your hiring and your contracting is supporting diversity goals? And you get questions of, once you've got workers and contractors, how are they being treated with wages and things like that? So that's kind of what shows up there. And I'll take a pause because that's a lot.
And to put a point on that, the difference between those two is the questions are scored. They're the things that you all are going to be scoring as part of your evaluations. The checkbox down below, those are requirements. And so the scoring lets you move. The scoring is part of you competing with others, whereas below is the requirements.
And they're linked because they're linked because it's the thing, the things that you declared in your application and got scored on become part of your contract that you report on.
And it looks like Jeffrey has a question.
Great. And just to get so folks know where we are in this process, we sent this out to you all yesterday. This also went out to stakeholders yesterday. And so we're going to be checking in with folks and hoping to get that feedback and summarizing a lot of that feedback. But this is sort of what went out yesterday.
Yeah, and actually just to bring it back to what Sam shared earlier. So the first cut on the high level approach, there was a check-in in January with stakeholders. They said, yeah, that's a good approach. Then we started working on the fine grained detail, shared that in these 3 sessions last week to say, are these the right questions? How's this going? And then have sent that out with the actual draft so that they could read it and not just have a presentation and share their feedback with us. We'll have another iteration working with you all. When the draft goes out for public comment of the criteria and the scoring, this will be included. So there's one more point of public comment.
Jeffrey?
Yeah, just a quick question. So in regard, a lot of these questions seem to be about what they'll do in the future. Are any of these questions about historical data? Is that implied, such as, what have they done in the past?
That's a great.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
No, are you done? Are you done? Sorry.
So just what have they done in the past? Have they traditionally done this? I think in a couple of our meetings we've talked about, we want to reward people that have been doing this. Obviously, you want to encourage people to do this as well, right? And make it a priority for them. But at the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge the people that have been doing this for the right reasons from day one. So I saw that you mentioned that that you're going to make sure they haven't violate any rules or laws. That's the kind of their historical check mark you guys have put so far for what you've talked about. But what about what they have done that aligns with our goals prior to even knowing about this PCEF coming into existence?
That is a fantastic question. It shows up in, I think, 2 places. So one is in your in the application as a whole. You're talking about that the applicant talks about their organization and its history. So it shows up there. Your past performance isn't something that becomes part of your equity agreement, because the equity agreement is what I commit to deliver with this grant. And so we have our eye on that question is because it's so important, and it's where does it show up? So part of it shows up in that speaking about your past as an applicant. It shows up here as well in that if you said, you know, when I say, well, tell us about your recruitment strategy and, you know, and how you'll be hiring, and you would say, you know, you could say something like, I'm going to be looking for firms that have had a demonstrated history and commitment, or one of what, you know, and then you could say that's who I'm focusing on, and we would look there. To one of the things that we understand, or we think we understand, is some of the proposals will come in and people are going to know, this is who I'm subcontracting with. I got that figured out. We talked about it, I got a bid. And we expect there'll be a fair number, or maybe even the majority, that come in and they don't know who the contractor is, but we're gonna ask, like, how are you gonna go about selecting them? And something like that would be something we would look for. But as far as what becomes, and then how it shows up in their agreement is, did they follow, you know, through on that? Does that make sense? And is there something else you would finesse or look for the workforce and contractor equity agreement, the thing to which we hold you accountable for?
I'd have to think about that, but it answered some of my questions on that.
Well, let's.
I think Michael also has his hand up.
So I'm going to continue on with that on the other end, which is, are we going to do follow-up checks with the workforce and with contractors? For example, the solar industry in Oregon has no people of color solar contractors. They have one somewhere like down South in Ashland or something. But I mean, basically there's
Little Oregon.
No solar contractors of color. They have almost no employees of color. If they hire employees of color for solar projects, because we're going, I mean, this is just from my own personal research, are we going to do after checks? So if their workforce becomes diversified, then immediately after the project is done, does their workforce de-diversify? Do we contact their workforce with like a 3-month follow-up? Like, are you still employed? Are you still working for the company? Like, what was your experience? Are we doing any of that, or is it just once the project's over, we wash our hands of it?
I have a couple thoughts on that, but Sam and Katie, I just saw your hand, Katie.
Oh, I guess I just wanted to make sure that everyone was kind of keeping in their, like, because I have struggled with this as I've been thinking about it and thinking about kind of accountability, just trying to keep in our, remember that as a city and a program, our contract will be with the nonprofits. And so then the nonprofits will be contracting with these contractors, and who will have the majority of the workforce, and who, and so there are, you know, that doesn't exonerate us of any responsibility to do what we can to ensure that those contractors are, you know, moving in the direction of having a diverse and inclusive workforce and workplace. But it is important to, I think, just important to kind of keep tracking that, or like keep remembering that, and also kind of noting that a lot of the feedback that we've gotten from nonprofits is who are not as familiar with kind of contracting and construction practices, is some nervousness about that, like nervousness about their responsibility as, you know, the entity that has a contract with the city to deliver on these things. So more just a comment. Michael?
So just a clarification, when we talk about like partnership surveys and reports and kind of random payroll audits, things like that, are we performing those, or do we expect the nonprofit to perform those? When we're collecting this data, like if there's a contractor that a nonprofit has, are we collecting the data on their workforce, or is the nonprofit responsible for collecting that data?
So that's another good question. Let me get to that, but finish your first one before I move to that. One about that issue of how people are, you know, whether they stay on. I think there's a piece of, again, like how we try to steer people towards the good practices. When we have this thing about, tell us about your strategy around recruitment, retention, and advancement. So it's one of the things we'd want to look for there as far, you know, and we call out like not hiring people to meet the goal and then moving them to another project to meet the goal, you know, so there's an opportunity to talk about like, my organization is 80% women and minority and it has been for 5 years and this is what, you know, what we do. The tracking question is an interesting one in that there's a lot of an appetite across the city and the region to be able to see how people are, you know, oh, they were on this project and then they moved up, and we can be tracking people. That's something that, and Sam, you can weigh in, like we are engaged in the conversations of the other people, like work systems and the city who track apprentice and workforce data to see if there are ways to be getting a better picture of if we are growing careers. But that's like complementary to our reporting effort, which takes me to your third question on the data and who does the reporting. So one of the things that we've looked at as far as what does reporting look like is we're trying to get systems that make sure that we get the data we need for PCEF to put something on a dashboard on a website and also be manageable for folks. We're trying to find platforms that are already out there that people use and are familiar with, or that we're hearing it's becoming industry standard, they would probably be comfortable. Sam, do you want me to mention those right now or no?
I'd say go for it, but I do want to call it, it's a little bit after 7. I do want to make sure we give everyone their break, and because we listed down for a while. So it depends on, yeah. I'd say
yeah, do you guys want to take your break now and come back, or finish that thread?
I'd say finish the thread and then, yeah.
Okay, so so there's 4 main reporting tools that we were looking at in this space. People who are doing like pre-apprentice training, like Constructing Hope and those folks, their work systems uses something called iTrack, and so that's going to get your, you know, enrollment and participation and graduation, and they track people. I think it's like 3 years after the program to see if they got placed and how they're doing. For the work that's around giving business technical assistance and supporting businesses, that one is Outcomes Tracker is the name of that platform. Prosper uses that, and that gives us some information about who's being served and how businesses are able to start up or scale up. There's LCP Tracker is the one that's around workforce data, and B2G is the one that's around your subcontractor data. So yes, the grantee would be entering their information in these platforms, but we also have our eye on what's a threshold where it would be silly to ask people to do that, and they can just report on the things they said and we could capture the data. The part about the random audit, that's the one where we say we're not going to on every single grant have them send all their payroll information, but that's the one that's on not the construction ones and the reporting platforms, but your basic, like, I agree to pay my staff the 180 requirement. And we're like, great, you signed that, you promised to do that. We're going to do random checks from time to time on various grantees to make sure that people are complying. That's what that random audit one is about. Sam, is there anything you want to add to that?
I think that's it for now. There's more we're going to dig into.
They're great questions.
I'm feeling like, I think because we're probably going to really be digging into the substance of the questions, that I'd want to almost just entertain taking a break now, because I think once we get into the questions, this is really where we're going to spend the meat. This is where we're going to spend the meat of our time.
All right, well, it is 7:04, so let's I'll reconvene at 7:10. You get an extra minute to your
extra
break.
Minute.
All right, sounds good. I'm going to pause the recording momentarily.
Great. Okay.
Sam?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to come back to, Jeffrey, to your question around just that historical, how folks have done historically. I think it's a thing that we certainly will, it's a question that we've kept out of we discussed it as a team at length because we were like, okay, that clearly there's a relevance and there's an importance to that piece of it. But we wanted to keep that tight. So what are you going to agree to do in this particular project? And so we had discussed that would sit within the rest of the grant criteria on performance, that just how folks have performed before. That said, I think that's a place that we want to make sure when we come back to you all, as we start digging into the grant criteria, that you keep your eye on that and how we make sure that capture, I think, the pieces you're speaking to around just folks that have a history of demonstrating that experience. So I'd certainly I'd love to hear just more around, and I think we will talk about that starting the meeting on the 12th next week, the scoring criteria. But if there are questions we need to think about, at least if they don't fall here, it doesn't mean that we can't intentionally think about them elsewhere.
Yeah.
Okay. Also, you sounded like you guys were going to go, you guys had it in a different section as well, as what Janet was saying. So I think I'm going to wait to hear a little further on in the presentation. I might have a little bit more questions.
Yeah, and it's not in a different section today for the workforce contractor equity, but in a sort of in the broader, when we talk about this grant application, workforce and contractor equity, kind of like that diagram up there, it's just a section of it. And so we had talked about sort of just, I don't sit as close to those conversations, so I'd pivot to Janet, you or Katie, to speak to sort of how you all thought about that in those other sections.
Yeah,
well, Ranfis has his hand up, and he is also on that subcommittee. So Ranfis, did you have a question or want to comment on that at all?
No, I mean, I think I think Jeffrey brought up a good point for us to consider, and I feel like I've heard this comment brought up by both contractors and folks in the workforce side. I mean, I think history of performance, especially when it comes to utilization of diverse contractors and workforce, I think is a key performance measure that, over time, as we go into multiple years of PCEF, it might be worth having some kind of evaluative criteria. I know it's distinct from the applicant proposer, if you will, but the main contractors who were performing this, I think it is worth thinking about how you sort of evaluate that sort of metric. And I think especially for your contractors who have performed on public projects, there is some data, if you will, from the city, the county, port that might be accessible to get. But I think, I mean, it might be a challenge for this first year, but I think succeeding years, I think it'll just be critical. Like, I don't think folks want to compete against other, I guess not proposers, but at least either proposers and or contractors who say they'll do something but don't deliver or never deliver. And I think that's, I think over time you just want to build confidence in people and the utility of this application. So I think I'm just more interested in how this conversation rolls out, but just wanted to, I think something about what I think Jeffrey and even Michael have highlighted seems to resonate with me. So.
Yeah, and we're so wholeheartedly agree. And that shows up partly that when you're talking about that performance, so some of it is what you proposed on a contract and did you deliver, and then the next time someone's applying, you've got that in eye. But even in year one, I just want to be clear the difference between questions that we're scoring folks on, tell us about your performance as an organization or the contractors you work with, and that's hugely important and will be part of what we evaluate and score. That's different than what's in your workforce and contractor equity agreement, which was just kind of where this part of the conversation was. We must have a workforce and contractor equity agreement with anyone who gets dollars what are the things that need to be in that agreement? You agree to the wage standard, you agree to safe conditions, you agree to meet the goals that you said you were going to meet, you know, what are the things in the agreement? So I just want to tease those apart, and they are related, because the way some of it gets in the agreement is because you made the promise on your application. So that's, yeah, but we absolutely want to be considering, does someone have a track record?
Okay.
And we'll look for your keen input on the best ways to make sure that that's showing up.
Sounds good.
I mean, there's a recognition that there is certainly, and this is in as much as we're going to learn in the broader in administering these grants, we are certainly going to be learning quite a bit in this area. And I know one area that I wanted to touch on was, you know, on our meeting on the 31st last month, I know, Michael, as we dug into talking about grant eligibility, Michael, you mentioned specifically, is there going to be a requirement for prevailing wages on all PCEF projects where such a prevailing wage exists? And so I think that's something that it'd be worthwhile to talk a little bit about now, because that does connect to at least one of the questions that is asked, and want to talk about sort of how we've at least set the stage for being able to come back and more thoughtfully answer that for you all. Just for context for the committee, you know, prevailing wage generally is the rate paid to at least 50% of workers in a specific occupation category: electrician, plumber, carpenter, for a local area. Prevailing wages typically can be set as the local union wage for a given construction project, or it's that 50% wage. So it can happen a few different ways. And within Oregon, the Oregon Bureau of Labor and Industries updates the non-residential prevailing wage twice annually. So since just that meeting, we've connected with the Bureau of Labor and Industries to just make sure we fully understand Oregon state statutes and laws around where prevailing wage currently applies and where it's applicable. And I think that's just important context to set, so you all get a sense for, as the laws exist today currently, what are PCEF projects subject to? And so I want to set that and lay out some of the things that we expect to come back to you all on the 21st with, when we bring this conversation back with some of the feedback. So just starting out, generally speaking, prevailing wage within Oregon on PCEF projects, as we've laid out, as we've walked through with BOLI, it's going to be subject specifically to projects with at least $750,000 of PCEF dollars, right? So that's sort of the threshold.
Public
That's
dollars.
Of public dollars. So it's not just PCEF dollars, but it could be, they could have 500,000 PCEF dollars and 300,000 in state dollars, and that would trigger prevailing wage. That said, I think there's some nuances that are worth explaining there, because I know not all projects, there's me some question marks there. And I should also just point out that there's still a floor within the PCEF code. 180% minimum wage is obviously the floor. And then we go into where does prevailing wage become applicable, which is higher than that in most instances. And so if an applicant proposes to retrofit, you know, hundreds of homes, and they put on a proposal for $1 million, generally the way prevailing wage applies to that is each one of those home retrofits are considered an individual project and therefore not subject to prevailing wage. So it is about really one site, one geographical site, one project. And then generally what, you know, PCEF is, schools are, well, there's a little nuance around language around schools, but if you saw a school or a public entity, you know, the city of Portland Metro, a government entities, Portland Public Schools apply, then prevailing wage would be subject on nearly all of those sorts of installations. And so gives you just some nuance of where it currently applies. And then there's this broader policy call. And so when we hosted our workforce and contractor equity discussions that took place last week, we specifically in the second conversation that was targeted towards those doing capital construction projects, we specifically talked and raised a question about prevailing wage, and we expect to get additional feedback in response to that survey. But just anecdotally early on, there certainly was a mix of stakeholders in that audience. So not coincidentally, there was a mix of understanding around prevailing wages. But that said, we did hear some feedback that was critical, some that was supportive, some that was seeking more information. At least one nonprofit raised serious concerns about the requirement, which they said could push a greater gap between nonprofits and the trades. One community-based nonprofit suggested we score this the first year and learn but not require it, and a couple other contractors said that we do not do that at all. And so we're going to get that feedback because I think it is really incredibly important that we round out that feedback for you all. And we'll come back to you all and lay out sort of some of the factors that you all should be thinking around as you evaluate and think about this. Recognizing that there's going to be a range of trade-offs and considerations you'll have to make around engaging diverse contractors, implication for residential contractors, implications for implementing this for contractors who haven't done this, whether a contractor is working 100% of their job on PCEF or not, and what it means for their workforce. And so I don't think we're not advocating for one or the other. We want to lay out that we want to make sure we bring that full consideration for you all. And as we kind of, with our remaining time here today, I want to make sure we capture other things you have questions about. So when we come back, we can make sure we hold a robust, at least answer your questions. And obviously the 21st is not the end. We will still go back and put everything out to public comment, but this will certainly be, that 21st discussion will be an opportunity where we can bring back a lot of our feedback to you all. So I think that's what I wanted to share, because I know that was a critical point that Michael, you mentioned on the 31st, and wanted to at least tee that up.
Michael.
I wanted to raise my hand first. I guess, so for the state, $750,000 on a capital project is where a prevailing wage kicks in.
By statute.
By statute. Can you make it more stringent? Can you lower that amount?
Yeah, it's a policy call. You can choose what by policy, by requirement, by state law, we have to do it at least at that point, right? So yeah, if you go over 750,000, we have to do it, no question. Beyond that, it's fundamentally, it's a policy call. That's what it is. Okay. A policy call, meaning it's. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, if it was a policy call. Okay.
Mm-hmm. It is.
We ready to move on then, or? Ranfis?
Just sit here to make sure. Yeah.
I think sounds like sounds like we'll be discussing the prevailing wage conversation further in the future meeting. It sounds like, I hope at least wherever we land on this first year, that at least there's some due diligence in getting on the front end, what are the potential public incentives or public funds, if you will, on a given project, just so we know as a PCEF that we're being a model entity and making sure that it's clear in the front end for contractors and or developers to know when a prevailing wage is being triggered. I think as our current statutes are on prevailing wage, it's really up to the developers and contractors to seek a determination from BOLI. So it's kind of like like you can either or you don't know, and maybe for some it's better not to know. But I think as an agency, I hope our values are, we ask on the front end whether folks are familiar with the prevailing wage laws or not, but they just disclose on the front end what are potential public incentives, just so we're being responsible and letting folks know, hey, your project's triggering the prevailing wage. So just for you all to consider and think about, Juan. And it sounds like this will be a much broader conversation in the next meeting.
Yeah, so Ronfis, the current draft has that information to guide applicants. So we let them know what are the things that are a trigger for BOLI wage, without, not that we're giving legal advice, but things they need to know, including things like it's cumulative. So if you got $600,000 to do a retrofit on your building, and then you realized you needed another $200,000 and now you're over, you would have to go back and pay prevailing wage on all the work you had done that already. So we do have some things that help them identify and check, is this subject to prevailing wage or not, as well as other programs. We want to look for that complementarity. Is it COEP funded, or is it one of the other, so we've got the main Prosper and City projects and Housing Authority to have them check so that we know to crosswalk and check in and make sure any of the other agreements are being met. Yeah.
Michael?
Yeah, I was just going to say that prevailing wage is one of those things that's really important to me, because part of what PCEF is doing is we're trying to build wealth inside of communities, and one of the best ways to do that is through prevailing wage. And I've been in the construction industry now most of my life. I've seen wage theft. I've seen people working prevailing wage jobs where they're not paying their employees, which is wage theft. I am currently working on I currently am commissioning a project where the electricians are a very diverse workforce that was brought in from, I believe, Georgia, and their electricians are making $24 an hour, which, as electricians know, prevailing wage is like $48 or $49 an hour. They brought people in for a diverse workforce, undercut everybody, underpaid them, and they're continuing unpaid because they're not under a they didn't trigger prevailing wage on this project. So I think that prevailing wage is a very important thing. And I understand that small projects, maybe like under $100,000, maybe can't meet prevailing wage. But I think there's a fallacy in that prevailing wage is something that contractors can't afford if we are paying for prevailing wage, right? If they are bidding at prevailing wage, they can afford prevailing wage, right?
I think the thing I think we want to tease out, and I think Michael, I fully appreciate that. I think the thing we want to tease out is we know, and I think that maybe, and I don't want to acknowledge, I don't want to speak to the commercial sector. I'm going to put the commercial sector maybe aside though for a second. I think the piece that is we want to kind of tease out is in some ways what we heard from some of the contractors where they've pushed back is they are the contractors that work on residential projects, and their concern is that they may have, they may expect to work on 10% of their projects, 20% of their projects are PCEF projects. And those PCEF projects, you're right, we could mandate make that as a policy call, and they pay that, but then they have a workforce that they then have to manage across that, and it's a morale issue. And at some point, it creates a decision point for them where they're either all in on PCEF projects so they can collectively pay that across their workforce, or they're not at all. And I'm not sure whether that exists. I think these are the things we need to tease out, whether that really all in, not in is a true thing that actually forces them to, and what implications that has for those small contractors that may be able to try to getting into PCEF as they start carving it out as part of their portfolio. And that speaks because right now, right, the BOLI, it sets the non-residential, the surveys that they do is for non-residential prevailing wage. There is a federal prevailing wage. That said, that's generally based on the union rate, and it's not necessarily based on the survey. So just teasing out, so it isn't, and at least with that one, it isn't entirely, there's uncertainty on whether that actually reflects an average or that median pay. And so those are kind of the pieces we want to tease out, is what implications does it have for those smaller, oftentimes more diverse contractors getting into the space, and whether that does create that. And I think we just need to do some ground truthing of that. And it may be that one of the proposals is we work with BOLI to get them to set the residential rate here so that is more reflective maybe of that sector. But there's work, because it will have implications for the signals that the program sets, and we can absolutely say we're going to send a clear signal and that's an intentional strategy to pull the market and require, but it may that loss of flexibility or whatever else may have implications, and we just need to be able to truth that a little bit more. And so I hope we can do that better on the 21st. But that's a little flavor of some of the things that I know we're going to be pushing on to understand better. And
Sam, to piggyback on that, if I was hearing correctly, there was a concern that, especially when the market's hotter and there's work to be had, that some of the folks that were the very targeted population would then maybe not apply because they could get work elsewhere and this was just too much of an extra administrative burden or something like that. And we didn't want an unintended, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that that was from at least a couple of folks that was like, I might not want to do this because it would be more headache than was.
I think we need to bring all of that feedback in and really tease out what I think that certainly could be one of them as well. That was a piece that had been raised, but there's just it would send a signal, and I think there are pros and cons to that signal. We just need to tease that out, and it's not to say one is better than the other. Right. It just I think we need to do more homework because it does have implications around the way things shape after this, and so I think that's what I'd.
Ranfis?
And Ranfis.
Yeah, no, thank you for this, substantive conversation. I just want to thank Michael for continuing to highlight the importance of this and, highlighting his own experience in the industry. I think having heard, I heard one contractor bring this up that, this is an opportunity, and I just want to make sure that I recall, like there were some concerns around administrative burden, around submitting the certified payroll, which details like how much you're paying workers on the project side, and just verifying that you're really certifying, quote unquote, what you're paying workers and the benefits. But I want to keep it as a positive framework. Like I think it could be even a stepping stone. And a capacity builder when you get a new slate of contractors who are building the capacity to submit certified payroll and be able to pay folks a prevailing wage. I think when we look at the barriers for folks to work in, public projects, people continue to point to certified payroll. So to me, like, I think, I want to hope that we continue to think about this as a lifting all boats approach, and that we're helping build capacity for contractors to do this work, and that we're that we make sure that workers are getting the wages they deserve on the work site. And I think one of the pitfalls with just doing our our wage standard is there's no workers don't have the information what the wage requirements are on the projects. Whereas I think, with the prevailing wage, contractors are required to post what the wages are per classification. It ensures at least workers have some information that they could either file complaints, whether that, or make sure that the contractors are honoring that. Obviously sometimes workers need advocates on the work site to make sure they get paid the wages they deserve. But when you don't have the information that you're supposed to be paid 180% of the minimum wage, it can be sometimes difficult to be a check in that balance. And I think so I just wanted to point that out. And I think construction has a historical case where even if you're submitting payroll or saying that you're paying 180% minimum wage, it's not, we don't have a system at the moment that's verifying that that's the case, that people are paying those wages. So yeah, I just want to sort of echo what I'm hearing from Michael, and just hope that we continue considering how this could be a good thing for both contractors and workers if we consider the standard.
Thanks, Ranfis. Now, are we ready to move on to the next slide? Are there more any other committee member comments or questions?
So I would ask if there aren't any, just please do, when we come back, I think it's helpful for us to be able to have questions that we can answer for you all when we come back on the 21st. We'll come back then we'll come back to the 28th, and we'll hopefully move things to public comment. And so certainly don't feel this isn't your only opportunity. Email us questions. Feel free to email us questions, and we want to make sure at least when we come back to that we can at least provide thoughtful answers and foster that. But We will certainly be summarizing that feedback from the survey when we do come back on the 21st. And just so it's clear, as it laid it out in the template agreement, the wages and the benefits were a point of competition. They're a question we asked about, and folks would be, expectations, folks would be scored on that. But the requirement is the 180% of wage, which is, as of July 1st, $23.85.
I think two other points related to that. There's a floor of what you have to meet and then what's happening in the marketplace. So it doesn't mean that you only pay that, because if it's hard to get workers, maybe you're paying more. But also, Michael, you mentioned the folks coming in from outside the area. And so I think that that should be showing up in our scoring, because if your recruitment, retention, and advancement strategy is, I'll be bringing in low-wage workers from outside the area, that should be showing up as a lower scored application. So I want to think about, with or without prevailing wage, how we're being thoughtful about those questions and scoring them and getting the information. And yeah, because I think, you know, the beneficiaries are intended to be in our area and not.
Yeah, I understand that. And, you know, I guess, I mean, this is a multi-state company, right? So they're employees of this company in Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
So they already belong to the company. They're not going to tell anybody that they're bringing in workers from outside of the community or outside of the state. And they are meeting the 180% of minimum. It's just, you know, labor is often construction labor, and this isn't necessarily labor for white collar jobs or anything, but construction labor is kind of the last, the value put on an hour of labor for people in labor is always minimized, right? It's thought of as uneducated or as not worthy of, like, not just living wage, but like actual wealth building wage, like actual, not just living, like I pay rent and food but actually build savings and, and that value is often not put on laborers. It's given that contractors should be paid well, but labor is often the bottom end of it, right? It's the bottom of the org chart and is often devalued, and especially labor that's people of color, that women are always devalued and not worthy of it, and contractors will always fight to pay less. And part of I see part of our job of creating a diverse workforce and building wealth in the communities is not to race to that bottom.
Mm-hmm.
So before we move on, I just wanted to say, kind of make sure that for the committee members who are not as well versed in sort of the workforce and labor world, that when you're kind of thinking about this and thinking about what questions you might forward to staff before the meeting on the 21st, like what would you need to know to be able to make a kind of an informed contribution to the decision about how prevailing wage as a requirement or as a score shows up in the grant process. So Sam and Janet have mentioned some issues related to differences with smaller contractors, differences between the residential and the commercial sector. I know some of the other things that I have heard people kind of wonder about is like what impact it would have on the cost of different kinds of projects. Like what would the difference be really? Would it be very big or would it be not that big of a deal? So I guess I would just ask for to think about what you feel like you would need to know to be able to, you know, ultimately it will be part of the application and scoring and process, part of the RFP that you all are going to, through, you know, your modified consensus process, make a decision together about. So, because it's complicated.
Money is always complicated.
It is. I mean, we had an interesting equity issue that came up in at least one of the sessions where folks that are at the nonprofit table see a greater inequity between the folks who have a voice advocating for labor and them, and they're trying to figure out how they'll pay 180 while the folks in the trades are going to get more. And what about that equity issue? So yeah, there's just a lot of questions for us to give thoughtful attention to and understand what are the relative trade-offs and what's the best thing for, you know, this place and this time, and think about those different angles and listen to our community about the implications. And it is complicated.
Faith, you had your hand up, but now it is down. Was that intentional, unintentional? Question or comment?
It was an intentional hand up, and then my microphone stopped working, so it seems to be back. So I think I just wanted to appreciate you for asking the question for those of us who are not as versed in this subject. And I guess what I would love to understand is just, I want to understand the hesitancy that you heard on prevailing wages. I imagine that was on the residential side. Sam, you basically said as much, and with smaller contractors. So I really understand the idea of building wealth, and that seems completely in line with what we're trying to do with this, but I don't understand as well any hesitation to lowering or high, what is that? Whichever direction it is, right? So that we are more often able to require prevailing wage. So I guess I would just like to have that fleshed out, and I will say with some disappointment that these are the same issues that existed in a program 10 years ago, or maybe that was 7 years ago, and to think that we haven't made much progress, at least in the contractor community, with those that express that concern, or with BOLI having not really, you know, that we don't have residential wages for a lot of these jobs is really disappointing, because that's been a huge push with the city for a number of years. So that's all. Comment.
Thanks, Faith.
Yeah.
So it's 7:44. Sam and Janet, you're not at the end of your slide deck, and I'm just wondering how you'd like to. Oh, you are.
Yeah.
Oh, this is questions. Okay.
Yeah.
See?
That was. I had texted that a while ago. Yeah.
Okay.
We've done it.
So are there any other kind of more general, are there any other questions, I guess, in addition to the kind of questions and comments about prevailing wage, just for related to the Sam and Janet's kind of overall presentation that folks have burning right now?
I would like to acknowledge, oh, sorry, I forgot to raise my hand.
Nope, that's okay. Megan, Michael's so polite.
That is very polite, Michael. And I've appreciated learning from all you all that are more versed in this than me and asking tough questions. So thank you. My question is much more general and not kind of a different, more like Maria's, and asking about some of the language on the first slides. And I'm particularly curious about a focus on folks with disabilities. And we haven't talked a whole lot about that as a committee. And I am curious if that's defined anywhere, how we're defining it, if organizations you're talking to are defining that. Yeah, I just have lots of questions about that one. And yeah.
It is not defined. It is listed in, people with disabilities show up as an intended beneficiary group for the workforce and sort of the workforce and development and training programs in PCEF. We have done some, we have done some pretty proactive outreach to try and get more folks from organizations that serve people with disabilities at the table, but it is, I guess I'll just say, in my personal opinion, sort of an absurdly broad umbrella that represents, you know, that sort of covers many groups of people who have very different needs and very different desires and barriers. And so we are doing outreach and trying to hear from organizations that serve people with disabilities, but I would welcome, you know, a conversation with you about the conversations that we have had, if you have any thoughts about how we move forward with that, because I think it is an area where we certainly could, you know, we can always do better in all areas, but definitely in that area as well.
Thanks, I appreciate that. I'm happy to be part of a conversation, but I don't claim expertise. I have some connections and some kind of relationships, I guess. But yeah, I hope we can kind of all continue to have that conversation and bring in other folks into that if needed. But yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Maria. Or Megan. You're one of the M's. Y'all. Michael, moving on to another one.
I just want to acknowledge, Sam, when you were saying that residential, I mean, residential is always paid less. And if it came back, it would also be a lower level than commercial. There's no question, lower pay scale than commercial for residential. And so I can acknowledge that. I would never think that commercial prevailing wage would apply to residential projects. I would assume that they would, I would think that they would for multi-family housing, not duplexes or quadplexes or fourplexes, but if it's 70 units in a building, that's commercial, that's no longer residential, even if it's a residential building. But I understand that prevailing wage at commercial rates is untenable for putting solar on a house, right? I do understand that. And I'll just leave it at that.
Anyone else? So before we move on, I actually, with the agenda, we forgot to approve minutes. And so I would like to circle back to the beginning of the meeting and ask you all if there are any amendments that you would like to see to the 4/29 committee meeting minutes that were provided. And Michael and Megan, I'm just assuming that your hands are still up from before. All right, seeing no requests for amendments, we will call those minutes adopted. So thanks. So the last thing on the agenda before committee member comments is not so much a grant cap report back. I just wanted to let you all know, we sent out this kind of very high level survey to committee members because we wanted to get just a sense of your kind of initial reactions to different kinds of grant caps and also to just the concept of a grant cap in general. And the purpose of that was really just to help guide staff research efforts so that we can bring back kind of more fleshed out recommendations. And so I will just say that 7 of the 9 of you completed that survey. I don't put a whole lot of stock in it. You know, there's not nobody is tied to this because there's really limited information was provided. But generally speaking, I think the areas where people were most favorable was that most folks did indicate that they would support the idea of some kind of grant cap. So we wanted to make sure that, you know, the committee was even open to that as a concept before going too far down any path. And then the kind of grant cap that folks indicated kind of the highest likelihood that they might support is setting a maximum dollar amount per grant based on a percentage of total funds available. The methodology for creating a cap that got the most kind of negative response, I would say, is setting a maximum dollar amount that an organization can receive based on a percentage of its total budget. So I just wanted to report that back so that it is on the record, and also, you know, since it was sort of mentioned in a public meeting and y'all are kind of public officials now. But so we will take that input and bring back kind of more information about potential pros and cons, eliminating, I think that we probably will eliminate the idea of setting a cap based on a percent of the nonprofit's total budget. But for the other three methodologies that were mentioned for setting a grant cap, bring back kind of more information on pros and cons so that we can have a discussion as a full committee about setting a cap for large grants. And that's all I got on that one. Are there any closing comments from committee members or from Sam or Janet?
Nothing here except appreciation.
Sam?
Looking at committee members first, but okay. No, I just want to thank you all. I really appreciate. I mean, I think I know we've been at a pretty regular pace here, so really appreciate you all giving us a couple hours and then some, certainly, every week here. It's really important, and thank you. Next week is going to be, next week we'll start jumping head first into a lot of things. So please, we'll send you all everything we can as fast as we can, but really just ask you all to spend some time reviewing those materials so we're as ready for that conversation. And just thank you.
Michael's hand went back up.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to thank everybody for listening to me. Labor is a super something I'm really kind of I'm really into, something that's really important to me. So thank you all for listening to me.
Thank you. It's an important voice to have at the table for sure.
And for your opening inspiration, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, we can let you go 5 minutes early, and just know that since you all did complete the doodle poll, you'll be receiving, you know, just like a litany of meeting invites for the months of June and July. If not tonight, then probably early tomorrow morning. So please accept all of them. All right. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, you guys.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
So much. Good night.